The Powers Project.
Anthony, how are you today, sir?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's good to meet you.
You too.
For the listeners and viewers out there, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Hello, listeners. My name is Anthony Patrick. Hello. Hello is my real last name, just like the greeting. So in case you're wondering if that's what I really said, it was. And I host and executive produce a podcast called All the Boys, the podcast.
And I'll have to tell you, I don't remember how I came across your podcast. I decided I liked the title, and so I thought, oh, let me listen to it, and I was blown away.
Thank you.
I was like, wow, how's this hidden from us? It's like I almost wish there was a way, and I'm sure there is, and I'm just technically stupid when it comes to that stuff, but I wish there was a way to find podcasts that you're really interested in. And basically what your podcast is about is history of gay men who were in some form or fashion of power, if you will, and they got caught in public restrooms and how it affected their lives. And the thing I loved about your podcast the most is that you came from a position of power rather than shame, which is what everyone's been taught throughout the years. Like gay men should be ashamed of themselves and that they're cretins for doing this sort of thing. But you took a different approach, and I just love that. Why don't you tell the listeners and the viewers about that approach?
Absolutely. And I will say, first of all, I agree with you. There should be some kind of algorithm in the podcast streaming services that allows you to find podcasts that you may like versus just serving you up the top charts of the titles that, we all know and I'm sure listen to as well. So maybe you and I can start that as a side business. Sure. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to the podcast idea that is essentially All the Boys, the podcast. And that will, I think, help explain the genesis of what you were talking about. I'm in advertising. I've been in the advertising industry for about 20 years. And every year, as an out gay man, I'm usually asked to give a presentation about pride and the origins of pride to our clients, to our employees. And so every year I do that, and there's always the part of that presentation where I talk about the Stonewall Uprising and the fact that uprising occurred in response to decades of mistreatment of gay people and of LGBTQ people by law enforcement. And so it was after Pride this year and of giving that same presentation where I had a private moment and I was thinking to myself, what did happen to these men who in the lead up to the Stonewall Uprising and for many, many years afterwards were arrested on what were then called morals charges for being gay, for engaging in homosexual behavior as consenting adults. What happened to these men who were arrested, who had their names printed in the newspapers, who lost their jobs, who lost their families? And so I thought, I really need to look into this. And that's what sent me down the path of trying to find really any stories of men who had this happen to them. But what I uncovered was that there are actually a ton of very compelling stories of this happening to prominent men. And what was so fascinating to me about that is that I had never heard of these men. Particularly the man that I feature in season 1 of All the Boys, Walter Jenkins, who was the number one aide to President Lyndon Johnson for 25 years, and who was outed by a scandal like this. He was caught in a bathroom, actually twice, but that's a long story. You can listen to the podcast to figure out why that happened. He was caught in a bathroom twice, engaging in sex acts with other men and had to resign and went into obscurity. And so that's how I developed this insight that, as gay people, we don't have a lot of heroes. We don't have a lot of role models that we can look to in history. And there are many of these men who should be luminaries to our community, but Two things are true. One, we don't know about them because they never came out. They lived their lives in the closet. Or two, they were outed because they were arrested and then they were shamed and faded into obscurity. So I thought, let's try to uncover the stories of those men so that the generations that come after us can learn who they were and why they were important.
You make when you talk about Jenkins, for instance, you said he was caught twice, and yet he was still an aide to Lyndon Johnson. How did that happen? How did he get past, the stringent what's the FBI do? Is the
background checks?
Background. There you go. Thank you very much. The background checks. How did he make it through there the first time?
Well, that's actually an incredible question, and that question constituted one of the original, what we now call October surprises, where in an election year, some bit of news comes out that pertains to one of the candidates for president that threatens their likelihood of becoming elected. And what had happened in the case of Walter Jenkins was that he had been arrested on a morals charge in a bathroom at the YMCA with another man before Lyndon Johnson had become president. And then he was arrested again when Johnson was running for president. And the second time he was arrested, when the press started to do their digging, they uncovered the fact that he had been arrested before. And that's what caused the media, the FBI, everybody to ask that question. How did we not know this had happened? Because you have to remember, at the time, gay people were not allowed to have sensitive information. They were not allowed to have classified information because there was a belief that anyone who was gay would be susceptible to blackmail by malicious foreign powers. And so this became a real problem for Lyndon Johnson, who was cruising easily towards victory and suddenly was being questioned about his judgment of keeping someone at his side, very closely at his side. I mean, Jenkins was authorized to sign papers essentially on Johnson's behalf. How could he keep someone at his side who would have been susceptible to blackmail by foreign powers? And so that launched an FBI investigation. And, if you listen to the podcast, I go into some detail about why it wasn't known essentially that this had happened. And there are a few conspiracy theories. Essentially, it all boils down to, as I joke in the audio, it boils down to a pervert. So there's a question about the original police report. And, in Johnson's opinion, that police report originally only said, I believe it said like indecent act. There was sort of like a nebulous, vague phrase that the police used in the report to describe that first infraction by Walter. But in a different color ink appears the word pervert. And so there's a conspiracy theory that maybe that was added later for folks to cover their tracks about what had happened. And it's a pretty complicated story, but it's fascinating, which when I started to dig into the subjects and the subject matter of the podcast, I originally wanted to just bring history to the fore, but what I actually uncovered was the opportunity to bring these fascinating stories, that are interesting, whether you're gay, straight, old, young, or not. And the story of Walter Jenkins and that police report and the FBI investigation that followed is absolutely fascinating.
It is. And there's two things I'll tell you that when I'm listening to your podcast. One is that I realize you have done an extensive amount of research on this. You've sent off for records and things of that nature. Like, you did your homework. This isn't something where you just read it on Wikipedia. You actually did your own research, and how deep you get into it is amazing. And I go, God, that's got to be time consuming, to say the least.
Thank you. It is time consuming, and it's of course made possible by the resources that are available digitally. Doing the kind of research that I'm doing to be able to write the episodes of the podcast would have been much more difficult, even 10 or 15 years ago. But because so much information is accessible digitally, it's much easier. So I'm thankful for that. Also, I think people underestimate how much information they have access to. I read in the case of Walter Jenkins that the FBI had done an investigation, which of course Lyndon Johnson ordered in order to, approach that scandal in a way that showed that he was handling it properly. And so I thought, could I get my hands on the FBI report? And I just submitted a Freedom of Information Act request. And a couple of weeks later in my inbox appeared a report of, at least 100 pages that had every possible detail of Walter, the other man who he was arrested with in the bathroom, whose name was Andy Choka, as well as, anything pertaining to sort of that era of background checks and so forth. And it was a treasure trove of information. And so, I've been geeking out a little bit on the information that's available to us and how I turn that into a story all these years later.
Well, I want to say one other thing too. The format that you use in order to tell these stories is absolutely, like, I just find myself mesmerized. Now, you have a great voice. I hate my
Thank
voice,
you.
and so I have a hard time listening to myself.
You have a great voice. You're a podcaster. You're living it.
Yeah, someone's always like, "Oh, you have a great voice," and I listen to it and I go, "I don't know what you're hearing, but what I'm hearing is not that."
It is true that we sound different in our heads than we do when we listen to ourselves in headphones.
But you have a great voice, and the way you tell the story just keeps you like intrigued. Where where I'm waiting there for the next word to come out of your mouth because I'm that excited about hearing where this story's going. And one of the things that I found myself doing when I'm listening to when you were talking about Jenkins, and then also the other guy was Hinson.
John C. Hinson, yes.
Okay. I was like, okay, these are two people. I hope you have a lot more people to go because I don't stop. And that's
well, it was so funny because I, actually, and I'll tell you about John C. Hinson, and in many ways, John C. Hinson's story is even more fascinating than Walter Jenkins' story, in part because of a fire that I talk about in the podcast. But it was interesting after I finished the first season of the podcast, which is all about Walter Jenkins. And by the way, there's some how should I describe it? There's some adult language and situations in the podcast, so it's interesting for me to share that with family and friends because they're going, oh, this is kind of a side of you we haven't heard you talk much about, but I say that because my mom, who is a loyal listener, called me after listening to season 1 and said, who's next? Right. After Walter Jenkins. And I said, oh, I kind of forgot to make sure that I had enough people to populate multiple seasons of this story. But luckily, I almost immediately found the story of Congressman John C. Hinson, which led to season 2. And I'll tell you, I have a few more subjects in the hopper for future seasons.
Well, that's great news because I seriously look forward to it, and I guess I binge listened to your next episode coming out.
Well, I try to keep them, I don't write episodes on purpose to be 20 minutes long, but for some reason, most of them end up being about, 18 to 20 minutes long, which I feel like, if you're going for a walk, you can listen to that and then maybe listen to a couple songs. It keeps it in a single use environment, or if you'd prefer to binge, you can easily do that too.
Well, normally I wouldn't, but again, I was so fascinated with your podcast that I was like, that's what I didn't want to listen to music. I wanted to find out the next story. And one of the stories that you talk about is the one of George Michael. Now, I happen to love George Michael back in the day when no one knew he's gay. And I remember being young and thinking, I hope he's gay. And then he turned out to be gay. I was so glad. And so when you tell the story about him, and after you told what he did after the event happened, I loved him even more. I was like, good for him. I just thought that was amazing what he did, and that perspective that you come from, and that you talk about to some extent about. I don't know that you say it directly, but that instead of being ashamed of these behaviors, because I'm losing track here. Let me take a step back. There's a sheriff over in a county here in Florida, and he likes to call them, people who get caught in the bathrooms and stuff. He would call them degenerates and everything else. And it's easy for someone to say that when they come from this pedestal that they put themselves up on of morality, and not realize that society is to blame for why gay people resort to going to the public bathrooms, or why they did, especially back in those just recent years.
Too recent.
Right, too recent. And because there was no safe place to go, if you weren't out, and you couldn't just go up to somebody and go, hey, how would you like to go out sometime? Because you don't know how that person's going to react. You don't know if that person's straight or gay. And so there really weren't any options, especially for people who were not out of the closet, because you couldn't risk being seen in a gay club somewhere or coming out of a gay club. And so the bathrooms were really the only place for them to go.
Absolutely. And that was, and I want to come back to George Michael. This happened for him a little bit, later in the story overall of, gay men, meeting up in bathrooms. But I'm a huge fan of his as well. So I definitely want to touch on that. But what was so interesting for me as I started to formulate this story was, why was this happening? Why are gay men having sex in bathrooms, or why were they having sex in bathrooms in mass numbers, and I got to learn about cruising, which is what we call it in the gay community, whether it happens in a bathroom or anywhere. It's essentially going out and heavy flirting, looking to hook up or to have sex with somebody. And you make an incredible point, which is that for a very, very long time, I mean, most of history, except for maybe the last couple of decades, and I'm only talking about the United States, because certainly it's still illegal to be gay in many countries in the world right now. Gay activity was illegal. There were sodomy laws, what are called sodomy laws, on the books almost everywhere. And that meant that any sex acts that were not heterosexual, essentially missionary sex acts, were illegal. Putting your penis in someone else's mouth was against the law. And you'll have some folks say, well, that's not an anti-gay law, that's a something else law. But the fact of the matter is, the people who were engaging in those behaviors and who were arrested and targeted for those behaviors were overwhelmingly gay people. And so when you think about and by the way, not only that, cross-dressing was illegal. All of these activities that are sort of like part of the LGBTQ plus experience, were against the law. And so where were these people to go? Where were they to go to act on their most natural desire, which was to find companionship, whether that means just friendly companionship, or a sexual partner. And so I talk in the podcast about risk mitigation and how, being a gay person involves so much risk mitigation every day. It means even today in 2020, when I'm in upstate New York in a very Republican district, which it happens to be where I am, I don't hold hands with my husband. That's a risk mitigation behavior. I don't want to find myself in a situation where someone is attacking us, essentially, either verbally or even physically, for displaying gay behavior. And so the thing about a men's room is that, first of all, you eliminate half the population, right? So you're only talking about men being in a certain space, and then you get into the gaydar world, which is like, if you're in a public bathroom and you're doing anything except your business, if you're making eyes at somebody, if you're lingering a little too long, and if they are doing the same thing, if they are behaving in the same way, the risk of you making a move that causes someone else to become angry or violent is pretty low. If they're making eyes at you when you're at the urinal, you kind of know what they're interested in. And so that environment, and of course it's within four walls and they're usually in private areas, So that, that gave gay men an opportunity to find each other, first of all, because there were no apps, there were no phones, the bars were raided all the time. So that in and of itself was a risky area. So in a bathroom, you could meet up, and you could pretty much rest assured that if you followed all the signs and signals, you weren't going to end up into trouble.
And so, because of that, because of these conditions, these circumstances that gay men were put in, your feelings, as is mine, is that there should be no shame to that behavior, to the actions, because again, that's what we were relegated to. There really wasn't any other options out there.
I agree with you. There should not be shame of it. Society should be ashamed, and should have been ashamed at the way that they, essentially forced gay men into these situations. The case of George Michael is interesting because for me, I was born in 1980, and I turned 40 this year, and I didn't know of any gay people growing up, that were famous. I mean, I couldn't point to a gay person. Even Liberace really never came out, and I mean that was kind of like the biggest, most visible probable gay person you could imagine. Elton John married a woman in 1984. When I was 4 years old, and so Ellen DeGeneres coming out was really the first situation, or the first moment for me where I saw an out gay person. And of course, it's hard to imagine now. Well, it's easier to imagine now because she's sort of being vilified for a whole other ball of wax that she has happening in her life. But, she's been very successful. But at the time, she was vilified for that. George Michael was arrested, for those who don't know the story. And for those who, by the way, don't know who George Michael is, he was an absolutely enormous star, a pop star in the 80s and 90s, formerly of the group Wham, then went solo. Just incredibly successful singer, songwriter, composer, performer. He was arrested and was not out. He was not out. And he was arrested in a men's room in Beverly Hills, and in the late 90s, which effectively outed him, which is the thing that happens to, the people in all the boys that I feature. And what I think appealed to you about that story, and what appealed to me about it, both then as a 17 or 18-year-old coming to terms with my own sexuality, and now as a storyteller, is that George Michael absolutely refused to be ashamed of what had happened to him. He was in the unique position where he was essentially in the closet to try to hold on to his career, and to try to not alienate his fans, and to try to ensure that his being gay didn't get in the way of him performing and putting his art out into the world. And so he resorted to these bathroom liaisons to preserve his privacy, essentially. And he was targeted by a police officer who instigated the incident with him in the bathroom, and he was arrested. And he probably for a few days was a little bit down about it, and he went back to England, and then he said, you know what, no, this is ridiculous. I am George Michael, and you all can just back up. And he released, on the back of that arrest, a greatest hits compilation that featured a new song called Outside, which was all about public sex, and the video is hilarious and sends up his arrest. He ended up getting sued by the police officer who arrested him. Of course, a judge, threw out that lawsuit. But that made him a hero for me, whereas some people might have said, look at this pervert, look at this degenerate, fooling around in bathrooms with men. He said, no way, not me.
And that you're right, and that's what I loved about him, because he took control of the narrative. He's like, this is me, this is my life, and I'm going to put it out there as to who I am, and I will refuse to be ashamed of my behavior and my actions. When again, he has, it's almost as if you have to, because he wanted to make sure that he, like you said, he didn't alienate people, so that he could continue with his career. So that's, if anything, that's on society, that someone that as artists, you have to do that in order to be for people to listen to your music or watch your shows or do whatever you do.
Yeah, I mean, Ellen, a year earlier, when she came out, she lost everything. So this happened to George Michael. I believe it was like a year and a half after Ellen famously came out on the cover of Time magazine, and then essentially lost everything and had to go into hiding almost for years. So this was something that entertainers did at the time, and I mean, since the dawn of entertainment, basically.
Well, and the thing is that there were examples of it. Bob Paris, who I don't know if you know who he is,
I
probably
don't.
he was a professional bodybuilder for the IFBB. Probably the most gorgeous man to ever step on the bodybuilding stage. He was again. I was like,
How do you spell his name?
and I remember thinking, I hope he's gay. He was. So,
I love that you hope people are gay. I love this. I love that you look at people and you're like, I hope they're gay.
do you know how often they turned out to be? And I'm like, I had hoped Tom Daly was gay. He's gay.
Oh yeah, definitely.
There's this kid who played on Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman. His real name's Chad something, and I remember seeing him. I go, I hope he's gay. He's gay. That's like all the beautiful.
You should start putting bets on this.
Exactly. Um, but anyway, Bob Paris came out. He was the very first male professional athlete while still in the sport to come out. That was 30 years ago. And
Wow.
you can see what happened to his career as soon as he came out and how he was basically ostracized from the bodybuilding community, which I find hilarious because so many of them are gay and in the closet. And yet,
Of course.
you have either the gay ones who are in the closet or you have, people like Gary Stridham. And I don't give a shit if Gary Stridham says anything because I have text messages from Gary Stridham, who was also a very popular bodybuilder back in the day, who's a homophobe. That's all he is, homophobe. And so I'm sure Bob had to deal with that on top of everything else. Plus, the Weeder brothers were not very gay friendly, even though. Again, I don't want to talk. I don't want to sit there and assume what went on behind doors and stuff. But as far as what they want, the image they were putting out there, they didn't want anything gay about it because they wanted to make money, and they knew that if the sport came out as being gay or overtly gay or whatever, that it was going to hurt the sport itself. So even Arnold Schwarzenegger, who did nude photos and stuff, and for a gay man, and those were never made public. Those were never talked about because again, that image had to be hidden that anything about bodybuilding was gay. So we see firsthand, and I'm sure I'm not going to say George Michael knew who Bob Paris was, but he was a beautiful man back, and he's still a beautiful man today. He's an older gentleman, but he looks awesome. But they could see firsthand what people went through who actually did come out and what happened to him, because Bob Paris was on Oprah. I remember that. And I thought that was amazing that she actually had this man on the show, because bodybuilding's not one of the three major sports, but
right.
He was the first person to come out and while he was still in the sport. And like I said, that was 30 years ago. So
well, listen, I mean, thank you, Oprah. I mean, I started first grade the September she started her show, and I watched it. I mean, for my entire life until it ended. And while I had seen gay people on other talk shows, it was usually in a pretty salacious, sensational type environment. And Oprah was the first place, I believe, where I saw Greg Louganis, the diver. And so many other gay men presented in a position of power and influence and reverence. So I mean, thank you, Oprah. And George Michael, actually, if you're listening to this and you want something to watch on YouTube later tonight, YouTube George Michael's appearance on Oprah after his arrest in Beverly Hills, because it is absolutely hilarious to watch George Michael try to explain cruising in public bathrooms to Oprah. Oprah, who really wants to understand it, and it takes her a little while, and then it finally clicks, and it's very funny.
Oh, by the way, Greg Louganis, I also hoped was gay. So,
Right. There you go. Actually, if you look back at old photos of him, he looks like Tom Daly. They actually kind of look
yeah,
alike.
well, he was so hot, and I had such a crush on him back then. He wasn't my first crush, but he was definitely or I go, God, that boy's so freaking hot.
I saw him on a plane a couple of years ago. He was sitting in first class, and I got on, and I thought, oh my God, I think that's Greg Louganis. And it was one of those situations where the row of, if you remember being on planes were things that used to
Yeah,
take people different places in the air.
kind of weird.
So I was on, I was standing there waiting to kind of like put my bag up, when we all were paused in the aisle. And so I was basically paused right next to him. And I wanted to say something, and I didn't, because I didn't want it to turn into a whole thing, because everybody was pretty stationary. But I was starstruck. I thought, oh my goodness, that's Greg Louganis.
Yeah, it would be. I'm like you. I won't. I've seen people, famous people, and I won't go up to them because I don't want to. Especially if they're with their family or whatever. You don't want to make a scene.
Yeah.
But yeah, but it would be hard, especially with Greg Louganis. It'd be hard.
Well, he's such a hero. I mean, for those who don't know the story of Greg Louganis, he was an Olympic diver, and he was gay, and he was in the closet, and he also was HIV positive, and he had an accident on the diving board, and the pool that he was competing in. I don't know the exact circumstances around whether it was actual competition or whether it was kind of like a qualifying round or something like that. I also don't understand sports. So, but anyway, this thing had happened, and it caused him to do what we call, coming out twice, which is he came out as being homosexual and has having HIV, and became an activist, and became a real, and remains, a real activist and hero of our community.
It was really odd at the time because he had hit his head on the diving board when he did a backflip, and it was during competition, and because there was a little blood that got into the pool, they drained the entire pool, and I'm not going to sit there and make a big deal about it because back then no one knew what HIV, how it could be transmitted and stuff. So they were being cautious. But you're right. He was, not only is he outed, but he's outed as someone who's HIV positive, which, as I'm sure you're aware of, even in the gay community, there's backlash from certain gay people who again put themselves on a pedestal and they want to judge people who have HIV, which I just find ludicrous. And that they would
Sure.
think of attacking someone who has HIV.
Sure, it's awful, and actually, one of the, again, I feel like having been born in 1980 for some reason puts me at this interesting moment in gay history where it was like the 70s had just closed out, free love, it was craziness, and then you enter the 80s, and I grow up as a kid in the 80s hearing all about AIDS, right, and what was happening with AIDS, and that's when it exploded in the United States and around the world, and so it's fascinating for me. So what that means is that for my entire life, the notion of sex has always been tied up in the possibility of contracting HIV/AIDS. And so what's so fascinating to me about looking at these stories and uncovering these stories about like the 60s and 70s is that was not a concern for these men at all. And so that's just another kind of interesting nuance of this notion of these men, looking for sexual partners in public places and behaving incredibly, promiscuously. And just when I read the stories, I think to myself, and they did not have to worry as much as the men who would come after them about potentially contracting that which became a deadly disease, in the early 80s before there was treatment. So it's just an interesting angle I find of that experience for these men.
It is, and having been born before the 80s, I can tell you,
1979, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
I never thought about that, but you're absolutely right that you were born into an era where you can never think about sex without thinking about HIV and it being something that could cost you your life having sex. And so where I grew up before then, and it wasn't a thought. It really wasn't. Even
Right.
even when it was discovered, there were still a portion of people out there who didn't take it seriously, who didn't think
Mm-hmm.
that it was possible for them to get it. And I was, for better or for worse, I was very fortunate to be in the closet. And I say that because I'm a whore. And so I have no doubt that had I been out, then I would have gotten it. I have no doubt about it. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
thankful that I wasn't and wasn't able to, to do that, and not, not to make light of it, but I know that in fact that, there would have been a good chance that something would have happened had I been out at the time, because I was probably one of
Well,
those.
because society didn't take care of gay people in this moment. I'm reading right now, The Normal Heart, the play by Larry Kramer, and which I've seen before, but I'm just reading the printed text of it. And it's fascinating to see how the various factions of the LGBT community reacted to the AIDS crisis, and their responsibility, our responsibility, essentially, to take it on and solve it and protect ourselves as a community, and to advance the cause of trying to find treatment, because nobody else was doing it. The government wasn't talking about it. The newspapers were writing about it on page 30. It just wasn't taken seriously as a public health crisis because it was overwhelmingly impacting gay men. And so that's just yet another example of, we talk about shame, and of course there is absolutely zero shame, that should be involved with having HIV or AIDS or any illness. And yet that's again what gay people were made to feel, because society dismissed and marginalized them. And so, that's just a recurring theme of all the boys, and about the people that I talk about, is that, how destructive shame is, and how we just needed to flip it on its head, like George Michael did, and said, I'm in this position in part because of what the box that society is forcing me into, and I'm not going to stay inside of it.
And I would say that's the pervading message of your podcast, and I love that message. I love that one of not having shame and not letting it, dictate your feelings, as far as saying, "Oh, I'm worthless because this is what I resort to." Um, so, again, I love that. I love that take on it. And I hope that the people who listen and watch this particular episode, whether whether you're still in the closet, whether you have HIV, whatever your situation may be, there's no need to feel shamed. And if there's anyone in the gay community who tries to make you feel shamed, you know, it's not about you, it's about them. There's something wrong with them. They feel less about themselves. And the only way they can feel better about themselves is to try to shame you or embarrass you, because there's some self-hatred from themselves that's going on. And so, you just have to keep that in mind. I tell people that all the time. Whenever people lash out at you, it's very seldom has anything to do with you and everything to do with them.
Sure, hurt people hurt people.
There you,
Right. I mean, that's what
exactly.
that's what it is. Hurt people. And and if you are listening to this right now, and if you are in the closet, or you're in crisis, or you're not sure what to do, I mean, and you don't know this, already, there are resources out there that can help you. There are community resources. You can access them digitally now because we're in the COVID age. So, reach out to these resources on Twitter. If you just Google gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer service organizations, the Trevor Project is amazing, the Human Rights Campaign. So, so speaking of the Human Rights Campaign, one thing that's happened to me as I've been developing this podcast is, we're talking about shame. I won't use the term shame, but I'm disappointed in myself that I didn't know all of these things that I didn't know about our community and our history. I shouldn't be, because no one ever teaches you any of it. I mean, it's similarly to like what I was talking about during the AIDS crisis. It's up to our community to both capture and teach ourselves our own history. But I didn't really know the history of the Human Rights Campaign, and that was something that I got to talk about with a woman named Kate McQueen, who was a very good friend of John C. Hinson, who's the subject of season 2, and she mentioned the name Steve Endine to me, and I had never heard that name before. And Steve Endine essentially founded what became the Human Rights Campaign, and I thought, why don't I know that? That's just so frustrating that I don't know that history. But that's essentially why I'm doing this project. But the story of Kate McQueen is fascinating because, for those who don't know, John C. Hinson, he was a congressman from Mississippi, and he had been elected to a term in Congress, and he was running for re-election when he decided to come clean with his constituents about some things that had happened in his past, including these arrests on gay-related morals charges. And so in season 2, I talk about the story of John C. Hinson. John ended up dying of AIDS in 1995, and in his obituary is quoted a friend, Kate McQueen. So that was, that obituary is from 1995, and I thought, again, to try and humanize these men beyond just press reports about them, how can I do that? And so I tracked down Kate McQueen, the person who was quoted in his 1995 obituary, and just with some internet sleuthing. And we had a fantastic conversation, much of which you can listen to in the podcast. But what I uncovered in that conversation is she also is this incredible LGBTQ plus activist whose name I had never heard of. She was on the board of the Gay Rights National Lobby, an organization I had never heard of, in Washington, D.C., and has fought really her whole life, predominantly for lesbian rights, but also for rights across our community. And I just encourage people, particularly people in our community, to make time and make a plan to engage with our history and do some digging, because you're not going to find it by looking at the history books and the history programs that you see right now. I was so thrilled to discover someone like Kate McQueen.
And again, that's one of the things I love about your show, because I feel the same way. I go, why do I not know these people? And I don't, but I'm learning through your show. And so I just think there's so much value to what you're doing, because we do need to know our history. And and as you just said, there are no history books. Half the schools, you go to some place like Tennessee, they want to make it so you can't even use the word gay, in class.
Absolutely. You're not even allowed to broach the topic,
Right.
let alone have sex ed.
Right. So so we can't depend on the public school system to teach about gay history, because they're not even going to talk about people who were gay in history who achieved amazing things, because it doesn't fit their narrative. I guess they might think it's promoting a gay lifestyle if you were to talk about the achievements of gay men throughout history. So we can't do that now, can we? So.
Well, no, and also, going back to the insight that drove the idea for All the Boys is that we don't know, who these luminaries are in history who were gay. We for the most part, we don't know who they were. They died closeted. And so that's a real shame. I'm sure that there are people who contributed incredible and incredibly valuable achievements to society, who were gay, and we just don't know it. And so what we do know are the ones who were outed because they were arrested. And so what I'm trying to do is at least dust off the pedestal for those folks, to allow us to say, you know what, there was this guy Walter Jenkins was he was essentially the chief of staff before that was like a real job, but he was the chief of staff essentially to Lyndon Johnson and his aide for 25 years. And he was at the right hand of the most powerful man in the world, and he was a gay man. Now, I should also say, Walter Jenkins actually never came out. He was married, he had 6 kids, and he never came out. But what we do know to be true is that he was arrested twice in bathrooms, in sexual situations with men.
Well, 2 things. One is that this is what you do, is that you've taken these men who've been shamed, and you restore their respect and dignity because you show the things that are really important, what these men accomplished and who they really were, and that you don't take one action and then try to discredit their entire life's work because of this one action that shouldn't be a shameful action to begin with. And the second thing is that you know, I've always been a big believer that you should come out when you're ready to come out. And I despise people. And there have been other gays, they called them, I guess they would be considered a celebrity, who've tried to out people. And I think you're the worst of the worst. You're a parasite on society's ass. You're because you think that these men who are in the closet owe you something, that they owe us something, that they need to be a role model because they're gay. They don't owe you anything. They don't owe us anything. What they owe is to themselves, and they should be able to come out when they want to. Now, whether I agree with them hiding in the closet or not, that's entirely up to them. I was in the closet for decades before I came out. I came out on my own, though, and because of that, I accepted who I was 100% at that point. I can't imagine.
I mean, the exception for me is, I agree with you 100%. The only exception for me is when people are actively campaigning and pursuing policy that is damaging to the LGBTQ plus community. Exposing the hypocrisy of that, I think, is very important. But you're absolutely correct to say, people need to come out on their own terms, and they should, again, to the original sort of inspiration for the whole story, they should not be outed or have to be outed by something like an arrest, for example.
Right.
In the case of John Hinson, he was a Republican congressman from Mississippi, the subject of season 2. And, I wanted to make sure, you talk about research, I wanted to make sure that if I was going to highlight this gentleman, that I wasn't highlighting somebody who did actively pursue, legislation as a congressman that would be damaging to our community. And as it turns out, he was not a congressman for very long. He was only a congressman, I think, for 2.5 years before he was forced to resign in scandal. And I tell the story in the podcast that there was one vote on some bill that was going to have negative consequences for the LGBTQ plus community, and he would have been expected. John would have been expected to vote the way the Republican Party wanted him to vote on that, which would have been to sign it in, and he took a walk. He took a walk when that vote happened. And so I thought, okay, now I'm sure there are probably other bills he may or may not have voted for that had negative consequences for other communities. I don't know what those are. I don't know the complete picture, but I do know that as it pertains to our community specifically, he did remove himself from that moment.
And that's at least a somewhat honorable thing, rather than to actively fight against. Which, being part of the Republican Party, you would almost think that he would do that. As we know, we've seen several in closeted Republicans sit there and not just vote against the LGBTQ community, but actually be the leader of that.
Mm-hmm.
Certain ones now that that I believe are gay, that have been caught in precarious situations, and yet because their daddy was rich enough, they were able to get out of it and sweep it all under the carpet, if you will. And they're some of the most anti-gay senators and congressmen that we have, and I always say, look, if someone's fighting that hard against us, you can rest assured they're in the closet.
Oh yeah, thou doth protest too much.
Yes, I believe the lady doth protest too much.
Yeah. Yes. Agreed. So yeah, I mean that's, but no, I mean I certainly don't want to be in a position where I'm ever outing anyone. as I'm telling their story. And I never want to, I don't think it's fair to out people. You know, this is the thing, you know, the consequences are still very real. I think we forget, you know, as people who, let's call ourselves coastal elites, you know, because that's what the Republican Party, many of them would call us. You know, we live in cities that are very accepting, and but in many parts of this country, it is not accepted to be gay, let alone transgender. Um, and and so the fight's not over, I think, is what people need to remember, you know. And I think actually one of the consequences of people being displaced by COVID, you know, if people have left the big cities that they usually live in and have gone back to live with relatives, you know, where they've got a bit more space to roam, they're seeing, oh, you know, I see Trump signs in these yards. I see lack of acceptance in the people that are kind of walking around. I see a lot of amazing things too, and don't get me wrong, and you know, let's recognize the positive where it exists. But I think this movement of people in response to the COVID pandemic is showing us that there is still work to be done. It is not a given that you can just come out of the closet these days and everything is going to be rosy in your life.
You're absolutely correct. You're I think you hit it right on the head when you say coastal elites, because that's where many of the cities, you know, are, that where, you know, you have places like New York or Seattle or even Orlando, even though we're not on the coast, our state is obviously. And we live in these cities that are populated with a pretty good, large gay community. But when you go out to states like Indiana or Kentucky or, you know, Oklahoma or these places, you're right, they don't have that luxury that we have, and we tend to forget that the rest of the world isn't like us. You know, we tend to forget there are countries where you can still be killed for being gay, because, you know, fortunately for us, you know, we've had these rights for a number of years now, and we forget what it was like beforehand. And even you made a point earlier, is that there's still, you know, it's still not complete. You know, while we can get married, we can still be discriminated against for housing. We can be
Mm-hmm.
discriminated in certain areas of the country for, you know, to as far as employment goes. And so it's we're still not 100%.
Adoption.
Yeah, adoption. So we're still not 100%, you know, where we need to be as far as our rights go. We're still treated like second class citizens, maybe less so than we once were, but it's still not, you know, full rights like heterosexual people have.
No, the problem is not solved. I mean, you know, I'll be giving something away here, but I campaigned quite heavily for Pete Buttigieg, Mayor Pete, when he was in the running to become the Democratic nominee for president. And I did some of that campaigning in South Carolina, which is the state that my husband is from. And we went door to door. My husband wasn't with me, but I was with other volunteers with the campaign. And we went door to door canvassing. And I'll never forget this one door we knocked on, very affluent, you know, pretty neighborhood outside of Columbia, South Carolina. And I knocked on the door, and a woman opened the door, and I had my boot edge sweatshirt on, which is the sweatshirt that explained how to pronounce Mayor Pete's last name. And the woman looked at me, she looked at the sweatshirt and looked back at me, and she said, "You are campaigning for him?" And if looks could kill, a chill went through my body. And I said, "Yes." I said, and I started to launch into some kind of policy, you know, talk. And she just shook her head. She said, "No," and slammed the door. And I was campaigning with a heterosexual woman, or canvassing, I should say, with a heterosexual woman. And she looked at me and she said, "What was that?" And I just looked at her and I said, "That was homophobia." And, you know, this February 2020.
Yeah, well, it still exists in all forms, and sometimes even in people that you would be surprised. Like I find it, I don't know if shocking is the word. I don't think anything shocks me anymore. But you know, when I see other minorities who will put down gay people, like you do realize. I actually had a black gentleman one time. He came out of the movie theater who was with a white woman, and he saw me holding my hands with my boyfriend, and he's like, and he said, "What the fuck?" And I go, "Really, really, you're gonna say something to me when 20 years ago they would have hanged your ass for what you're doing." They
I
wouldn't even.
think we talk about that a lot with with the gay community, and the people who suffer most in the gay community are also visible minorities. We talk about the intersectionality of being black and gay, or Hispanic and gay, and how difficult that experience still is, and how marginalized those communities can still be, even within our own communities. And so, to your point, any marginalized group, we need to work together. We need to work together to recognize, look, we're all in this together, and let's support each other, let's lift each other up. And I do want to say, I was, listen, when I was in South Carolina, which is a state I love, and it's where my husband is from, there was a lot of acceptance too, and I was thrilled to see that, and we were welcomed there. So it just, we just need to work together to understand what's happening, and make sure that we're all advancing together.
I think might be where your show can. Why I feel it's so important is because when I talk about that gentleman, I shouldn't even use the term gentleman, because he was really a younger guy. I mean, he had to be in his early 20s at the latest. And I think with not just with blacks, but with gay youth as well, they didn't go through the struggle. They don't know the struggles that their parents went through. Gay um, guys today who are in their teens or their 20s, they didn't go through the struggle that people of my generation. Now, I'm not going to say I went through the struggle because I was in the closet, but those who weren't in the closet, the struggle that they went through in order for these kids to be able to have the rights that they have now and enjoy those rights, they don't know the struggle that the generations before them went through in order for them to get to that point. And so it's almost as if they take it for granted because they don't know that there was a struggle.
Well, no one ever told them.
Right. And
no one ever told them that there was. I mean, I think, I'll have people say, I mean, like, what's the big deal? Just come out. Look at my Instagram feed. All of these celebrities are out and everybody loves them, and there's no issue. And yes, that's true now, but it's because of the bravery of all of these people that came before us in the face of real consequences. Like, I don't think people realize that it was illegal. Not only could we not get married, I mean, it was illegal to engage in homosexual sexual behavior. Illegal.
right.
Like, I just like, I can't stop saying that enough, because it's like, well, you could, well, why didn't you just come out? And it's like, that actually would have been very dangerous for many reasons, not just because it could have been attacked and ostracized and marginalized and all of these things, but like, I could go to jail. I mean, it's the penalty. When John Hinson was arrested for oral sodomy at a Library of Congress bathroom, he was facing a 10-year prison sentence.
Wow.
A 10-year prison sentence. This is while I was alive. I mean, this was like 1981, I think, is when he got arrested, February of 1981. 10 years in prison. Not for this happening in public, but for it happening at all. And, I think when people say like, oh, well, I mean, like, so-and-so is out and so-and-so is out and so-and-so is out, and it's fine. We've moved past that. Think about how far we actually have come and how much more impossible, really impossible, not just challenging, but I think in many ways impossible, it would have been for these people to come out at that time.
I agree. It was in 2000 something when that couple, the gay couple in Texas, who were having sex in their house, and the cops broke the door down because the neighbors knew they were gay and were pissed off that they were gay, And so the cops said, "Oh, that we heard someone screaming as if there was so." So they come in and they arrest the couple for having sex in their own house under the sodomy law. And this was this wasn't that long ago. I want to say it was 2005, maybe even later than that. I'm not quite sure, but
I've got to look that up. I hadn't heard of that one.
yeah, we're talking 15 years ago at most, I believe, and and certainly 20, because I know it was in the 2000s that this happened. It was under Bush when he was president, and I was like, this is absurd. That a neighbor who knows they're gay, who wants to get at them, so they call the police and say, "Oh, I heard screaming," so the cops break the door down and arrest them for having sex in their own home. So,
I mean, it's so infuriating, and I talk in the podcast about the notion of entrapment and what that means from a legal perspective, because in so many cases you have men who are arrested by police officers, and those men who are arrested did not instigate the situation, like this couple that you're talking about. I mean, they're in their home, they're having a private moment in their own home. Now, I thought to myself, if a police officer, like in the case of the George Michael arrest, if a police officer starts it and then a man responds in kind, isn't that entrapment? And in fact, it's not, because, I mean, a lawyer would answer this better, but essentially, if there was any sort of like potential that the individual might have engaged in this behavior, but for the police officer being involved, then it's not considered entrapment. But I mean, how is that first of all, just a good use of law enforcement resources to be sending men into bathrooms to arrest these men, to be sending people into people's private homes? It's insane.
It's because they want to get that vote from the majority, from the moral right, to sit there and look at the stuff that's going on in our city, and we're taking care of it. We're fighting the good fight against immorality, and it's all about politics. It always comes down to that, because I can tell you right now, there's as I'm sure you're aware of, there are plenty of police officers who are gay, who are in the closet, and not only does society have to bear some of the responsibility for these actions, the churches need to bear a great deal of responsibility. When a church tells men, that this is the devil, and you just need to pray and it'll go away. You get married, you have children, and your life will be okay. God will help you. Then when these men get married and they buy into all this nonsense, and now they have a wife and now they have children, and they realize, I'm still gay, I'm still having attraction towards men. Now, not only is it just this person's life that's going to be affected, but now you have a woman, you have children, you have their families as well, that are all brought into this fray, that are now going to be affected in a negative way, because you didn't tell him, be honest with who you are. Instead, you told him not to be who he was. And I can't help but say, you bear the brunt of the responsibility, because you have a follower who listened to your advice because you're a man of God. And same with kids who commit suicide, who are these churches, because these churches tell them they're an abomination, they're going to hell, and these kids commit suicide. I'm like, their blood is on your hand, whether you want to admit it or not. Their blood is on your hands, and there's no way to wash it off.
Yeah, that's such a good point, and it's actually interesting. I don't really talk much about the religious angle of this in the stories of the men in the podcast, but certainly, of course, that's must have been a huge influence on their decision making, specifically as it pertains to getting married, to a woman and having children. And I think a lot about the children, for example, of Walter Jenkins, who are in their kind of late 60s, early 70s now, I believe. And I did reach out to a few of them to try to talk to them for the podcast, and was not able to do so. Did not get a response. But it's fascinating for me to think about these people that are in the world now, and their father was the number one guy next to the president of the United States, working in the White House every single day, and then suddenly that's all over, and he's back in Texas, and everyone's just going on with their life as if that never happened. And is anybody talking about the reason for this? And don't people have questions? And of course, that's such a private situation for that family to have to deal with, in their four walls, but also such a public situation as well. So I do remain, fascinated and just endlessly intrigued by the children of the men who I talk about in the podcast and who I've yet to research.
One of the things that you did really, really well is when you talked about Walter Jenkins, you made sure that it was known that the people who talked about him when they were questioned by the FBI as to whether or not he would have ever given up, any type of information or been compromised, and they said absolutely not, which speaks to the character of who Walter Jenkins was, and that regardless of him being gay or closeted or whatever, he was a patriot, and he was extremely loyal to this country and to Johnson as well.
I'm so glad you brought that up. One of the reasons I specifically chose Walter as the first subject is because of how just undeniably upstanding and without any stain, on his person you could ever hope to see in a person, as described by everybody in his orbit. As he was a friend to everybody. Nobody, I mean, the FBI, when you look at the FBI report, they interviewed everybody, because what they wanted to find out, I'm assuming the FBI, what they wanted to find out is like, who should have known that Walter Jenkins was in the closet, and why should they have known it? And therefore, what should they have done about it but didn't do, so that we could point a finger, away from Johnson. And, first of all, nobody in his orbit, I'm talking from childhood friends to, I'm sure, his barber and his clerk at the grocery store, nobody had any suspicion that he was in the closet. But also, nobody had one bad word to say about this man. Everybody adored and revered him, and he was essential, to your point, as a patriot to the operation of this country. When Johnson was sworn in as president after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson was sworn in on Air Force One when it was on the ground in Texas. Jackie Kennedy was by his side. Walter was back in D.C., and nobody kind of knew that any of this had gone on yet with Walter. And Johnson, aboard Air Force One, wanted to make sure that when he got back to Washington, D.C., that the person who was going to meet him at the plane was Walter Jenkins, so he could kick off his presidency with Walter at his side immediately. I mean, this man is incredible, a patriot, and, not a stain on his record. And he should be famous for that, not infamous for being arrested in a bathroom with another man.
Agreed. I love what you do. I want you to I hope that you will continue with your podcast and find more, even if you have to go down the road of, of talking about gay men who were influential throughout history, even if it's not about the bathrooms, but route you take.
It always comes back to the bathrooms.
Here's a question. Okay, now remember what I told you. I don't edit my show, so think about your answer if you want before you answer it. Have you ever had bathroom sex?
I'm going to plead the fifth on that, but I will tell you, we talk a lot about, I guess I probably shouldn't say brand names, but look, I am a gay man who has gone to gyms. I have worked out in gyms. I've been in these all male environments. I mean, it is certainly still happening. Let's say that.
Yes. I have a friend of mine, a dear friend, who's a psychologist. And I said, with this day and age, with all these apps and, and people being out and stuff, I said, there are, sexual acts still going on in the bathroom. Why is that? I go, since they don't have to hide who they are anymore. And he said, there's an element of excitement there, of risk. And he goes, and those people who are who love risk. I'm sorry. I've been doing this a lot lately. For a new topic. Anyway, he said that who love that feeling of risk, they'll still participate in this because of the excitement, because it
Sure.
of all that. So
sure, that's it. Listen, let's be honest. I mean, doing it in public is a kink for some people, and that has nothing to do with whether you're gay or straight, or whether it's illegal or legal to do what it is that you're doing in that moment. And that's, of course, certainly a driver for why it happens to begin with, and why it continues to happen. But I think what's important to note, and that's why, and by the way, that would certainly be the counterpoint to somebody saying like, well, maybe it was illegal, but they just wanted to like do this, in the bathroom, and they were turned on and whatever. But the bigger context of it in history is so important, because of the fact that it goes back to this notion of risk mitigation, and the fact that, like, yes, for a certain percentage of the people who were doing this, they were doing it because they wanted to, and they could give a crap about the laws and whatever. But for, I'm sure, a much, much larger portion of people, they were doing this because this was the place that they could do it that carried the least amount of risk for them.
Agreed. And you make a very good point that you don't have to be gay to participate in this activity. I've actually been at a sporting event where a guy brought his woman in. They went into a stall, and I know, because you could hear them. I know
Sure.
in there. But see, guys won't complain. They'll just laugh or snicker under their breath or whatever.
Yeah.
And they'll walk in and out and do their business. And we're talking about a bathroom that was packed because it's halftime. And so the bathrooms get full, and they walked in there and did their thing. And every guy in there, not one guy had a complaint. Now let two gay guys go in there and do that and see what the hell happens.
There might be a complaint.
There might be.
It is possible that somebody may complain. Absolutely.
You made a point earlier too, which I have to say that, when I came out, I 100% said, and this is not taken away from anybody in how they handle things, because I don't, I handle things the way I handle them for me. And I always tell friends, I go, look, just because I would do it doesn't mean you should do it, because it probably won't work for you the way it works for me. But I decided that if I would hold my wife's hand or my girlfriend's hand somewhere, I will do it wherever I'm at with my boyfriend. And this is one reason why I have, like, I loved NASCAR, but and I had the ability to go to NASCAR races for free, and I just wouldn't go. And I said, because I will hold my boyfriend's hand, and I know there's going to be some dumbass redneck who's going to have something to say, and if I have to fight all 150,000 people there, that's what's going to go down. I don't expect I'll win, but I'll be damned if I'm going to change who I am. But I'm not the smartest guy either. So, but I am smart enough to go, don't go there then, because I'm not, because I know I'm not going to, put at least the person I love at risk. So.
Sure. I mean, again, it's risk mitigation. It's what it all comes down to. And it's like, how much are you willing to accept or not?
Yeah. And personally, when I die, I want it to be something really great, not by getting my ass kicked by a bunch of rednecks.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it.
Okay. Well, again, I want to tell you, I love your show. I look forward to the new episodes. I hope it continues for years and years. And anytime you want to come back on the show, if you have anything going on, you have a new season, you want to talk about it, please. I would love to have you on. You're a wonderful guest, and
thank you.
It's actually been a pleasure to meet you and to get to know you. So thank you so much.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much, and I would love to come back anytime. I've got to get that next subject lined up, and I've got to get the research popping. So give me a little while, but I'd be happy to come back.
Well, when I become as famous as Joe Rogan for my podcast, you can do one about me.
Oh, that's say that. Have you been arrested?
About bathroom sex.
Okay. All right. All right. That sounds like a plan. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Anthony. Folks, thanks for listening and thanks for watching. And until next time, take care, stay safe, and wear your mask.
Wear your mask.
There we go. Great. Thank you. Let me go ahead and stop the recording here.